What is supply? Fuel, food, supplies, and spare parts are the things that we think about when considering supply chains. In F&E, it's photon torpedoes in your tubes, dilithium in your engines, drones on the racks, shuttles in the bay, and barrels of blood wine in the galley. In this video, we'll go over the supply rules of Federation and Empire as we are using them in the Star Trek New Worlds campaign. Before we get started, the Federation and Empire rule set is a large and robust reference with many nuanced details. I recommend diving into this document to make sure we got it right and to ensure you don't get caught with a special situation not covered today. With that said, let's dive in. Units on the map are considered in supply if there is a supply route to a supply point and that supply point is connected to a supply grid. We check for supply at key points during the phases of a player's turn. These are at the beginning of the operational movement phase, for combat at the start of each player's turn and at the instant of combat, for repairs at bases during the repair phase, and for field repairs after retrograde movement. Speaking of retrograde, at the start of that phase as well. For more detail on the sequence of play, check out our tutorial playlist for the F&E 101 video, where you'll find out more about that. But what are the effects if you are out of supply? For movement, ships out of supply cannot use extended reaction movement, and their movement is reduced by 50%, rounding to the nearest whole number. But if a ship moves into supply during the turn, it will be treated as in supply at the end of the movement phase. For combat, ships out of supply have their attack factors, but not defense factors, reduced by 50%, rounding to the nearest whole number. This impacts all players regardless of which player is phasing through their turn. This applies to fighters and special units, with replacement fighters and PFs being unavailable if out of supply. For partial supply grids, any partial supply grid can perform normal functions with the cost coming from resources within the partial supply grid. Any excess cost is paid at 2 times the rate to facilitate Orion pirates ferrying the resources back and forth. Ships and units stacked on bases and or planets are always considered in supply, as are the base and or planet, provided there is at least one PDU or planetary ground base on the planet. Planetary ground bases are never out of supply. Supply points, routes, and grids. A supply point is a friendly base station, convoy, or tug acting as a supply point or planet which connects via supply routes to the homeworld to produce a supply grid. A supply route is a change of hexes determined by supply tech that connects the unit with the supply point. Starting at the supply point, you measure out the number of hexes to the range, and if your unit is within that bubble, you are in supply. Supply routes cannot pass through a hex containing an enemy unit, unless that hex also contains a friendly unit. Supply routes cannot pass through a hex adjacent to an enemy ship, unless there is a friendly unit adjacent to it or in that hex. Bases with 6 pseudo-fighters or 6 fighter factors or more have a similar effect to adjacent hexes in blocking supply, but not in unblocking them. A friendly base in a hex will unblock supply in that hex. As mentioned before, supply points connected by supply routes to the homeworld form a supply grid. Any grid isolated from the homeworld becomes a partial supply grid. Each economic point in a partial supply grid can support up to 5 units and or up to 12 replacement fighters. Partial supply grids will pay the supply cost at the start of the economic phase in a player's turn. Bases don't draw this supply cost as a unit, but their fighters, repairs, and other costs do. Partial supply grids accumulate unused EPs. If reconnected to the main grid, these stockpiled EPs can be sent to the homeworld. Otherwise, they are considered satellite stockpiles located at a specific base or planetary supply point. If the base is destroyed or the planet devastated where the satellite stockpile is located, the EPs are lost. They can only be moved by tug or by reconnecting the main supply grid. Convoys acting as supply points extend the grid but are not part of it. They cannot bridge a gap between supply points and are not retrograde points. Tugs acting as supply points can also serve as strategic movement nodes, but not retrograde points. Convoys can move and extend supply on the same turn. Tugs cannot. Tugs cannot move by any means while acting as a supply point. If forced to retreat or destroyed, then the tug immediately loses status as a supply point. Tugs and tug missions are their own topic, and if you want to learn more about all the neat stuff tugs can do, then put your comments below and let us know you want a video about them. If you're caught out in the cold and your ship cannot draw supply from a supply grid connected to your home territory, then you are a homeless ship. A host empire can provide you supply by paying half an EP per homeless ship and or 1 EP per carrier as a one-time expense. Once these supply lines are set up, this supply can be transferred to other ships, up to a maximum of a total of 24 homeless ships at one time. A host empire pays for replacement fighters and pseudo-fighters. The host empire can refuse to do so. If the empire has not reached the level of fighter or pseudo-fighter tech, then it cannot supply foreign ships with fighters or pseudo-fighters. Drone ships and stasis field generator SFG ships cannot use their special abilities while being supplied as homeless ships. Maulers and scouts are unaffected. The host player can cancel support at any time. If canceled, the cost must be paid again to set up the supply lines for hosting new homeless ships. The proper management, manipulation, and interference of supply can make or break a successful battle, war, campaign, or game. How will you manage yours when playing Federation Empire and our 4X New Worlds campaign? If you learned something, put it in the comments below. Hit the like button and be sure to subscribe for the latest updates on the campaign and tutorials on the channel.